You do not belong here." The words cracked through the ballroom-sized shareholder hall so sharply that even the soft music stopped feeling real. Conversations died. Heads turned. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of executives, investors, and guests dressed in expensive suits and evening attire. At the center of it all stood 16-year-old Ethan Brooks, a black teenager in a clean navy jacket and polished shoes, holding a conference folder against his chest. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the giant presentation screens hanging above the stage. Then the CEO took a step forward. Richard Whitmore was a man people listened to. At 52 years old, he had built one of the most influential technology companies in the country. When he spoke, entire departments moved. When he made decisions, markets reacted. And right now, he was staring directly at Ethan. "Security," Richard said, his voice calm but cold. "Please escort him out." A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Ethan blinked once. He looked around the room. Hundreds of eyes were suddenly fixed on him. Some looked curious. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply watched the way people watch a story unfold when they are grateful not to be the person standing in the spotlight. Near the front row, several investors exchanged glances. One woman lowered her coffee cup. Another quietly reached for her phone. Ethan's fingers tightened around the conference folder. He could feel his heartbeat in his chest. Not because he was afraid. Because he knew exactly how quickly people made assumptions. Richard folded his arms. "This event is restricted to invited guests." A few people nodded. Others remained silent. Ethan looked down at the badge hanging from his neck. Then he looked back at the CEO. "Sir," he said quietly, "are you absolutely sure?" The question seemed to catch Richard off guard for half a second. Then he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to encourage others to join him. Several people did. "Yes," Richard replied. "I am absolutely sure." More laughter followed. Ethan glanced at his badge again. "You never even looked at it." The room grew slightly quieter. Richard shrugged. "I do not need to." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman suddenly stood halfway from her seat. Her expression changed. Recognition flashed across her face. "Mr. Whitmore, maybe we should—" "Sit down," Richard interrupted. The woman slowly lowered herself back into her chair. Ethan noticed the concern in her eyes. The audience noticed it too. Something subtle shifted inside the room. The confidence that had filled the hall moments earlier began to feel less certain. Ethan remained calm. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once. Then, from the far side of the hall, a soft electronic chime echoed through the silence. Ding! Every head turned toward the private executive elevator beside the stage. The doors were opening, and the man stepping out was someone nobody expected to see until much later that afternoon. The elevator doors slid open with a soft metallic sound that somehow felt louder than the whispers filling the hall. Every eye followed the figure stepping into the light. Charles Bennett moved slowly, not because of age, but because he never had to rush. At 68 years old, the chairman of the board carried the kind of authority that could silence a room without raising his voice. Conversations stopped immediately. Even Richard Whitmore straightened his posture. Charles adjusted the cuff of his gray suit and looked across the crowded hall. His eyes moved from the stage to the audience. Then they settled on Ethan Brooks. Something changed in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Ethan noticed it instantly. So did the woman who had tried to speak moments earlier. Richard forced a smile. "Mr. Bennett, we did not expect you until 3 o'clock." Charles continued walking. Clearly, the single word hung in the air. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. Security guards who had been approaching Ethan suddenly slowed their pace. Charles reached the center of the stage and glanced toward them. "That will not be necessary." The guards immediately stepped back. Richard cleared his throat. "There has been a misunderstanding." Charles looked at him. "Has there?" The chairman's voice was calm, but something about it made people lean forward in their seats. Richard gestured toward Ethan. This young man entered a restricted event without authorization. Ethan remained silent. Charles turned toward him. "Did you?" Ethan carefully held up the badge around his neck. "No, sir." Charles nodded once. Then he looked back at Richard. "Did you verify his credentials?" Richard hesitated. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds, but everyone noticed. "I did not need to." A murmur spread through the audience. Charles slowly folded his hands behind his back. "You did not need to?" Richard suddenly seemed less certain. I believe the situation was obvious. Charles studied him for a moment. Then he asked a question nobody expected. And what exactly was obvious? Silence. The giant screens behind the stage continued displaying the company logo while hundreds of people waited for an answer. Richard shifted his weight. He looked out of place. The words escaped before he could stop them. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan said nothing. He simply stood there holding his folder while the room grew heavier with every passing second. Charles turned toward the audience. Interesting. He looked back at Ethan. Young man, what was your name? Ethan Brooks, sir. And why are you here today? Ethan took a breath. I received an invitation from the board office. The hall became completely still. Richard blinked. Several directors immediately sat upright. The woman who had recognized Ethan closed her eyes briefly as if she already knew what was coming next. Charles nodded. I thought so. Richard's confidence began slipping away. There must be some mistake. Charles looked at him carefully. That is exactly what I am trying to determine. Then the chairman turned toward the giant presentation screen and reached into his jacket pocket. He removed a small access card. The audience watched as he handed it to the technical director near the stage. Seconds later, the company logo disappeared. A new file began loading onto the screen. And when Ethan saw the title appear at the top of the presentation, even he looked genuinely surprised. The loading icon rotated across the giant screen while hundreds of people sat frozen in anticipation. Nobody seemed interested in the annual shareholder presentation anymore. Every ounce of attention had shifted toward Ethan Brooks and the mysterious file Charles Bennett had chosen to display. Richard Whitmore stood near the center of the stage with his jaw tight and his hands clasped behind his back. He was trying to maintain control of the room, but the room no longer belonged to him. A soft click echoed through the speakers. The presentation opened. The first image appeared. It was a photograph of Ethan standing in front of a community center in Detroit. Several children surrounded him. Some were smiling. Others were holding laptops. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Ethan stared at the screen in confusion. He had never seen this presentation before. Charles looked toward the crowd. 3 years ago, one of our scholarship review committees received an application from a 16-year-old student. Another image appeared. Ethan sat at a small desk beside a window, working late into the night. The room in the photograph looked modest. The furniture did not match the luxury surrounding the audience now. Yet there was determination in the teenager's eyes. Charles continued. The committee discovered something unusual. Every recommendation letter described the same quality. Not intelligence. Not ambition. Character. The room grew quieter. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Several board members exchanged glances. Charles clicked to the next slide. Charts and photographs filled the screen. Community technology programs. Educational workshops. Volunteer initiatives. Hundreds of students served. Thousands of hours contributed. Millions of dollars in projected social impact. The numbers surprised even the investors. Ethan blinked repeatedly as if trying to process what he was seeing. Charles turned toward him. You never asked for recognition, did you? Ethan shook his head. No, sir. You never asked for publicity? No, sir. Charles nodded. That is what impressed us most. The audience listened carefully. Every sentence seemed to pull the room further away from the assumptions made earlier. Near the front row, the woman who had tried to intervene finally stood again. This time nobody interrupted her. I know Ethan, she said. He worked with our outreach department last summer. Half of our volunteers stayed because of him. More murmurs followed. Another executive raised his hand. I remember him too. He solved a logistics problem our team had been struggling with for weeks. Suddenly voices began emerging from different corners of the hall. People remembered Ethan. People remembered his work. People remembered his attitude. The teenager who supposedly did not belong there seemed to have quietly touched nearly every major initiative connected to the company's community programs. Richard's expression continued changing. The confidence that had defined him earlier was disappearing. Charles noticed. So did everyone else. Then the chairman clicked to the final slide. The title alone was enough to make the room hold its breath. It read, Special Board Recognition Recipient. Beneath the title appeared Ethan's photograph. The audience stared. Ethan stared. Even Richard stared. Charles slowly faced the crowd. There is something else all of you should know. The chairman paused. His voice remained calm, but the weight behind it filled the entire hall. This young man was not invited here as a guest. Complete silence followed. Then Charles looked directly at Ethan and said, he was invited because today was supposed to be his day. For several seconds, nobody in the hall seemed willing to breathe. The words echoed through the silence with unexpected force. Today was supposed to be his day. Ethan Brooks stood beneath the giant screen, still holding the same conference folder he had carried into the building that morning. The applause that should have greeted him had never happened. The recognition ceremony that had been planned had never begun. Instead, hundreds of people had watched him be questioned, judged, and nearly removed from the room. Charles Bennett slowly stepped closer to the center of the stage. Some of you are seeing this presentation for the first time, he said. But the board has been reviewing Ethan's work for nearly 2 years. A new image appeared on the screen. This time it showed a crowded community classroom filled with students learning computer programming. Ethan was standing near a whiteboard, helping a younger student understand a problem. Another slide followed. Then another. Rural schools, scholarship workshops, technology access programs, mentorship events. The room watched in silence as the scope of his contributions became impossible to ignore. Charles glanced toward the audience. Most people measure success by titles. He paused. Sometimes they measure it by age. Sometimes by appearance. Sometimes by assumptions. Several board members shifted in their seats. Richard Whitmore remained perfectly still. Charles continued. The board chose Ethan because he represents something this company claims to value. The giant screen changed again. For words appeared across the display. Character before recognition. The phrase filled the hall. Ethan looked up at it. He remembered seeing those words years earlier on a company website while researching scholarship opportunities. He had admired them then. Now they felt different. More personal. More complicated. Near the front row, one investor slowly began clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, scattered applause spread throughout the room. It was not loud yet. It was respectful. Genuine. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Charles noticed. You see, he said quietly. That is exactly why he was chosen. The applause faded. Charles turned toward Ethan. When our committee contacted your teachers, mentors, and community leaders, do you know what they said? Ethan shook his head. No, sir. Charles smiled faintly. Not one of them began by talking about your grades. A few people laughed softly. Charles continued. They talked about your integrity. They talked about how you stayed after events ended. How you helped people when nobody was watching. How you solved problems without asking for credit. Ethan looked down at the folder in his hands. He was not accustomed to hearing people discuss him this way. Across the stage, Richard's expression had become increasingly difficult to read. The certainty that had defined him earlier was gone. In its place was something closer to discomfort. Charles slowly turned toward him. The room immediately felt heavier. Everyone sensed the shift. The chairman's attention was no longer focused on Ethan. It was focused on the decision that had been made before anyone bothered to ask a single question. Richard, Charles said calmly, I would like to understand something. The CEO swallowed before answering. Of course. Charles folded his hands. When you first saw Ethan this morning, what exactly convinced you that he did not belong here? The question landed harder than any accusation. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Richard Whitmore did not have an immediate answer. The silence that followed felt heavier than the applause that had filled the room moments earlier. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on Richard Whitmore. The question hanging in the air was simple. What exactly convinced you that he did not belong here? Yet no answer seemed easy anymore. Richard adjusted the button of his suit jacket and forced a polite smile. I made a judgment based on the information available to me at the time. Several people exchanged glances. Charles Bennett tilted his head slightly. Information? Richard nodded. Yes. The chairman waited. Nothing more came. The room seemed to lean forward. Finally, Charles spoke again. What information? Richard opened his mouth, then stopped. For the first time that afternoon, the CEO appeared uncertain. The giant screen behind him still displayed the words character before recognition. The phrase now felt less like a company value and more like a mirror. Charles took a slow step across the stage. Did you know his name? No. Did you review his badge? No. Did you ask why he was here? No. Each answer seemed to make the room quieter. Charles nodded thoughtfully after every response. He never raised his voice. He never sounded angry. Somehow that made the moment even more uncomfortable. Near the back of the hall, several employees lowered their eyes. Others sat perfectly still. Ethan remained standing beside the screen. He said nothing. His calmness continued to draw attention. Most people in his position would have tried to defend themselves. Ethan had done the opposite. He had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own. Charles looked toward the audience. Leadership is not the ability to make fast decisions. He paused. Leadership is the ability to make fair decisions. A murmur of agreement moved through the crowd. Charles continued. Anyone can judge quickly. Very few people are willing to understand first. The words landed directly on Richard. The CEO looked toward Ethan for the first time in several minutes. The teenager was standing exactly where he had been at the beginning of the confrontation. Same posture, same folder, same badge. The only thing that had changed was how people saw him. Charles noticed the glance. Interesting, is it not? He asked. Richard looked confused. What do you mean? Charles gestured toward Ethan. He has not changed since he walked into this room. Nobody spoke. His accomplishments have not changed. Charles continued. His character has not changed. His invitation has not changed. The only thing that changed was what people learned about him. The statement hit the audience with unexpected force. Several investors nodded immediately. Others began whispering among themselves. The woman from the outreach department smiled faintly. Charles turned toward Ethan. Tell me something. Ethan looked up. Yes, sir. When Mr. Whitmore asked security to remove you, why did you stay so calm? A few people smiled. They wanted to hear the answer too. Ethan thought for a moment. Then he shrugged slightly. Because I knew who I was before I walked into the room. The response was so simple that it took a second to register. Then silence swept across the hall once again. Charles smiled. Not a public smile. A genuine one. That, he said quietly, is exactly why the board selected him. The audience began applauding again. Louder this time. Longer. But Charles was not finished. He looked toward the technical director and nodded. Another file appeared in the presentation queue. When Richard saw the title, the color drained from his face. Because this presentation was not about Ethan at all. It was about leadership. The applause slowly faded, but the energy inside the hall had completely changed. What had started as a routine shareholder gathering now felt like something far more important. The giant screen behind the stage refreshed once again. The title displayed across it was simple: Leadership Under Pressure. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Richard Whitmore stared at the screen for a long moment. His expression remained controlled, but everyone could see the tension behind it. Charles Bennett stood beside him with the calm confidence of someone who did not need to prove anything. Ethan Brooks remained near the front of the stage, still holding his conference folder, still listening more than speaking. Charles looked toward the audience. Many people believe leadership is revealed during success. He paused. I disagree. The room fell silent. Leadership is revealed during moments when nobody has prepared an answer. Several heads nodded immediately. Charles continued. When plans change. When assumptions fail. When unexpected people enter the room. His eyes briefly moved toward Ethan. That is when character becomes visible. The next slide appeared. It contained no photographs. No charts. No financial projections. Only a single question written in large letters. What do leaders notice first? The audience studied the screen. Charles folded his hands behind his back. Every executive in this company was asked this question during leadership training. Some people smiled in recognition. Others shifted in their seats. Charles continued. The best answers never mentioned titles. They never mentioned wealth. They never mentioned appearances. He turned toward Richard. Do you remember your answer? Richard hesitated. Yes. Then tell us. The CEO looked at the audience before responding. I said leaders should notice potential. Charles nodded slowly. That is correct. The room became very quiet. Richard suddenly seemed uncomfortable hearing his own words repeated back to him. Charles looked toward Ethan. And yet today, potential stood directly in front of you. Nobody moved. The statement landed heavily. Richard opened his mouth as if preparing a response, but Charles gently raised a hand. This is not about embarrassment. The chairman's voice remained calm. It is about reflection. He looked across the audience. Every person in this room has judged someone too quickly at some point. Several executives nodded. A few smiled awkwardly. Charles continued. The difference is whether we learn from it. Ethan listened carefully. He could feel the attention of hundreds of people around him, but he remained focused on the chairman. Charles walked slowly across the stage. 2 years ago, the board created a special recognition initiative. A new slide appeared. The audience leaned forward. The purpose was simple. Find future leaders before the world notices them. Ethan looked surprised. He had never heard those words before. Charles smiled faintly. The committee reviewed thousands of candidates. Another slide appeared showing application statistics from across the country. Thousands of students. Hundreds of interviews. Dozens of finalists. The numbers impressed everyone in the room. Then one final statistic appeared. Selected recipient, 1. Silence followed. Charles turned toward Ethan. You were chosen unanimously. Audible gasps spread through the audience. Several board members began smiling. Ethan looked genuinely stunned. He had known he was receiving an award. He had not known the scale of it. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. The reality of what had happened earlier seemed impossible to ignore now. Charles looked toward him one more time. There is one final detail the audience has not heard. The chairman's voice softened. And it explains why today's events concern me far more than anyone realizes. Every person in the hall focused on him. Even Ethan. Then Charles reached for a sealed envelope resting beside the podium and slowly opened it. The sound of the envelope opening seemed to echo through the entire hall. Charles Bennett carefully unfolded a single sheet of paper and looked down at it for a moment before raising his eyes toward the audience. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked a phone. Hundreds of people sat completely focused on what would come next. Even the photographers near the stage had stopped moving. Charles held up the document. This letter was written 18 months ago. His voice remained calm and measured. It was submitted anonymously during our leadership review process. A few executives exchanged curious looks. Leadership review process. Everyone in the room knew how important those evaluations were. Charles glanced at the page. The writer was asked a simple question. Who best represents the future values of this company? He paused. The answer surprised the board. Ethan looked confused. Richard looked uneasy. Charles continued reading. The person who best represents the future of this company is not an executive. He does not have a title. He does not control a department. Most people in this building would not recognize his name. But he consistently chooses service over recognition and integrity over attention. A murmur spread through the audience. Charles lowered the paper slightly. The letter was referring to Ethan Brooks. Ethan blinked in surprise. He had never heard these words before. Charles continued. When challenges appear, he asks how he can help. When others seek credit, he steps aside. When people are overlooked, he notices them. Silence settled over the room again. Several investors nodded slowly. The words matched everything they had seen throughout the afternoon. Charles folded the letter. What impressed us was not the recommendation itself. He looked toward Ethan. It was the author. The audience leaned forward. Charles turned toward Richard Whitmore. The CEO immediately understood where this was heading. His expression tightened. Charles spoke gently. Richard, do you remember writing this? The room froze. Ethan looked from Charles to Richard. Several board members exchanged stunned glances. Richard stared at the letter. For a long moment he said nothing. Finally he nodded. Yes. A wave of whispers moved across the hall. Charles continued. You wrote it before Ethan became known to anyone outside our review committees. Richard nodded again. I did. Charles looked at the audience. At the time, Richard personally argued that Ethan represented the exact kind of character our company should celebrate. More whispers followed. Ethan looked genuinely shocked. He had never met Richard before today. The contradiction hanging in the room was impossible to ignore. Charles turned back toward Richard. 18 months ago, you recognized something extraordinary in this young man. He paused. This afternoon, you did not recognize him at all. The statement landed with incredible force. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Richard lowered his eyes. For the first time all day, he looked less like a CEO and more like a man confronting a difficult truth. Charles did not sound angry. That somehow made everything more powerful. The purpose of this discussion is not punishment, he said. It is perspective. He looked around the hall. How often do we fail to see people because they arrive in a form we do not expect? Several audience members quietly nodded. Ethan stood motionless beside the screen. The room had spent hours talking about him, yet he remained remarkably humble. Charles smiled faintly. That humility is one reason he was selected. Then he turned toward the technical director near the stage. Please show the final file. The giant screen flickered once. A new image began loading. When it appeared, gasps immediately spread across the hall, because the photograph revealed something about Ethan that nobody in the audience knew. The photograph filled the giant screen from edge to edge. For a brief moment, nobody seemed to understand what they were looking at. Then recognition began spreading across the room. It was a picture taken nearly 2 years earlier. In the image, a younger Ethan Brooks stood beside a group of middle school students during a technology workshop. The children were smiling proudly as they held small devices they had built themselves. But that was not what captured everyone's attention. Standing several feet behind the group was another person. Richard Whitmore. The CEO stared at the screen. His face froze. The audience immediately noticed. Charles Bennett looked toward him. Do you remember that day? Richard continued staring at the image. Slowly he nodded. Yes. His voice was barely above a whisper. Charles turned back toward the crowd. This photograph was taken during one of our smallest community outreach programs. Another image appeared. Then another. Ethan helping students. Ethan organizing equipment. Ethan answering questions. Ethan encouraging younger children who looked nervous about participating. In every photograph, the same pattern appeared. He was never standing in the center. He was always helping someone else stand there. The audience watched quietly. Charles folded his hands behind his back. What many people do not know is that Richard personally attended this event. Several investors looked surprised. Charles continued. Afterward, he spent nearly 40 minutes speaking with Ethan. Ethan looked up at the screen. He remembered that day clearly now. He had been 14 years old. Richard had asked questions about education, leadership, and technology access in underserved communities. It had been one of the most encouraging conversations Ethan had ever experienced. Another image appeared. This one showed Richard shaking Ethan's hand. A visible reaction spread through the hall. The contrast between that photograph and today's confrontation could not have been more dramatic. Charles allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. This is why the board was concerned. Richard lowered his eyes. I understand. Charles nodded. Good. The chairman's voice remained calm. Because this was never about one mistake. The audience listened carefully. This was about how quickly we forget what matters when we stop paying attention. Several board members quietly nodded. The message was no longer directed only at Richard. It was directed at everyone. Charles looked around the room. Today, Ethan walked into this hall with the same character he possessed 2 years ago. He paused. The same integrity, the same purpose, the same values. Then he looked toward Richard. The difference was not him. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Charles continued. The difference was perception. The room fell completely silent again. Ethan remained standing beside the screen. The attention surrounding him would have overwhelmed many people. Yet he still seemed focused on listening rather than defending himself. That quiet confidence impressed the audience more than any speech could have. Charles smiled faintly. Character does not become valuable when others notice it. He looked toward Ethan. It was valuable long before today. For the first time all afternoon, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the hall. It grew louder and louder until nearly everyone was standing. Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful. Then something unexpected happened. Richard Whitmore stepped forward. The applause gradually faded. Every eye followed him. The CEO looked directly at Ethan. The tension in the room shifted again. Nobody knew what he was about to say. Charles remained silent. The board members remained silent. Hundreds of shareholders remained silent. Richard took a slow breath and finally spoke. There is something I need to admit in front of everyone here. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the stage while hundreds of people waited for him to continue. The hall was so quiet that the faint sound of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. For a moment, the CEO looked down at the floor. Then he lifted his eyes and faced Ethan Brooks directly. There is something I need to admit in front of everyone here, he repeated. His voice was steady, but different from before. Gone was the confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of the afternoon. What remained was honesty. When I saw you today, I stopped paying attention. Nobody moved. Richard continued. I saw a person and immediately created a story in my head. I never checked your badge. I never asked your name. I never asked why you were here. The audience listened carefully. The truth is, I made a decision before I had any facts. A few people slowly nodded. Charles Bennett remained silent beside him. Ethan stood calmly near the screen, still holding the same folder he had carried all day. Richard looked toward the audience. The most troubling part is that I already knew better. His eyes briefly moved to the photograph still displayed behind him. The image of their meeting 2 years earlier remained visible to everyone. I met Ethan before. I saw his character before. I even recommended him. He paused. Yet somehow, I forgot the lesson I had already learned. The room remained completely still. Richard turned back toward Ethan. I owe you an apology. Ethan did not immediately respond. Richard continued. Not because you earned respect today. You already had it. Not because of your achievements. You already had those too. I owe you an apology because I failed to show the respect every person deserves before knowing their story. The words carried through the hall with surprising weight. For several seconds, Ethan simply looked at him. Then he nodded. Thank you, sir. The simplicity of the response seemed to affect the audience even more than the apology itself. No anger. No revenge. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Just dignity. Charles smiled faintly. That response, he said, is exactly why this young man represents the future we hope to build. A wave of applause swept through the room. This time it was immediate and unanimous. Hundreds of people rose to their feet. The sound filled the hall from wall to wall. Ethan looked overwhelmed but grateful. Charles waited for the applause to settle before speaking again. Today was supposed to be a recognition ceremony. He reached into the envelope he had opened earlier and removed a framed certificate. I believe it still should be. The audience erupted once more. Charles walked toward Ethan and handed him the certificate. The teenager accepted it carefully. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of everything that had happened. Charles then placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Never let other people's assumptions define your value. Ethan smiled. I will not, sir. Charles nodded. Good. The chairman then turned toward the audience one final time. Character sees value before status. That lesson is worth more than any quarterly report this company will ever produce. The crowd responded with another standing ovation. As the applause echoed throughout the hall, Ethan looked around the room. Earlier that day, he had entered as someone almost nobody noticed. Now the entire hall was standing. But the greatest change had not happened to him. It had happened to everyone who had witnessed the truth. And long after the applause ended, that lesson would remain.